In the quiet town of Annecy, France, full of reflections and calm, lived a man named Gabriel. A mixed-race architect of French and Asian descent, he led a simple life with his wife, Amélie, a smart and gentle woman who always appeared to be full of serenity. But life is not always as it seems on the surface. A house may look intact from the outside, yet inside it quietly cracks from the silence never spoken. A smile can hide a wound that has never been named. And love can slowly change direction, without anyone noticing when exactly it begins to fade. This is the story of betrayal, a sibling's dagger in the back, and the wounds that grow from shattered trust. It is not a story of revenge but of loss, and of how someone tries to keep standing, even when all that remains is the shadow of who they once were. A quiet tale of love that was never whole, and a house that is no longer the same. Annecy, a quaint town nestled in the southeastern part of France, often dubbed the Venice of the Alps. Narrow canals wind through old faded buildings, iron bridges arch gracefully across cobblestone streets, and the chilly winds from Lake Annecy carry with them the scent of damp wood and the first fallen autumn flowers. It was in this serene town that Gabriel lived with his wife, Amélie. Their home stood at the end of Rue de l'Isle, a narrow alleyway that opened directly onto the canal. The house, a 17th-century building, boasted a brick facade, dark green wooden windows, and a small balcony where Amélie would often tend to her lavender flowers every morning. Gabriel had always loved their home for its peace and tranquility, a far cry from the bustling city center. It was also near the lake, a place he had often visited in his youth. The house held many cherished memories, including the time he had proposed to Amélie on the nearby Pont des Amours, just a 15-minute walk away. But today, something felt off. Gabriel had just returned from an out-of-town project site. He had originally planned to arrive later that evening, but a sudden change in his schedule had prompted him to return early. He imagined Amélie would be surprised, perhaps greeting him with her warm smile and a hug like she used to. But as he opened the front door, all he was met with was silence. His footsteps echoed as he entered slowly. The old wooden floors creaked beneath his shoes. The soft afternoon light filtered through the windows, casting long shadows across the tidy living room. Too tidy. The sofa was arranged perfectly, the cushions angled symmetrically. On the round pine coffee table sat 2 white porcelain cups, both still steaming. Gabriel paused, bending down to pick up one of the cups. It was still warm. He looked around the room. Silence. No sounds of music from the kitchen. No footsteps of Amélie upstairs. He called out quietly, "Amélie." Nothing. Gabriel removed his work jacket and hung it on the hook by the stairs. He walked down the hallway toward the kitchen. There was no one there. The dining table was spotless, the dishes neatly arranged on the top shelf of the cupboard. But strangely, there was a thin scarf draped over one of the dining chairs. It wasn't Amélie's. It was dark, with a geometric pattern, something men typically wore. He turned back toward the living room. His eyes fell on a pair of brown leather shoes near the shoe rack. He recognized them immediately. They were Raphael's. Raphael Laurent, his younger half-brother, had been staying with them for the past 2 months. He had just graduated from architecture school in Lyon and was searching for an internship. While waiting for job offers, Gabriel had invited him to stay in their home. Raphael had accepted with a grateful smile, saying it would be a short stay, and Gabriel believed him. Raphael was the only family left after their mother passed away the year before. Though they hadn't been particularly close growing up, there had never been any major issues. Gabriel stared at the shoes for a long moment, then slowly walked up the stairs, treading quietly on the wooden steps. At the top, the guest room door was ajar. The bed was neatly made. There was no sign of Raphael. The door to the master bedroom was also open, and the room too was empty. Gabriel descended the stairs again. An uneasy feeling began to creep up his chest, like a cold cloud sneaking in unnoticed. He walked to the window and looked outside. The canal flowed gently beneath the small stone bridge. A small rowing boat was tied to a wooden post. On the opposite bank, old houses stood silently in the distance. There was no sign of life. He stood there for a long time, staring out the window. The autumn breeze filtered through the gaps in the old wood, carrying with it the damp, earthy scent of the season. The orange light of the setting sun bounced off the surface of the canal, casting flickering shadows on the ceiling. The front door suddenly creaked open. Gabriel turned around. Amélie appeared in the doorway, walking briskly, a small shopping bag in her left hand. She looked surprised to see him. You're home." Her voice sounded hurried. She tried to smile, but the smile didn't quite reach her eyes. "There was a schedule change. I thought it would be nice to come home early." Amélie nodded slowly. She lowered the shopping bag onto the kitchen counter, her hands trembling slightly. Gabriel watched her closely, his gaze never wavering. "Are you alone at home?" he asked quietly. Amélie stopped, glanced over her shoulder, and nodded. "Raphael left earlier. He said he was going to the library." Gabriel didn't respond. He simply sat back down on the sofa, his eyes fixated on the still warm cups. Amélie stood in the kitchen doorway for a moment before retreating to their bedroom, closing the door quietly behind her. The rest of the afternoon passed in silence. That night, Gabriel went to bed earlier than usual. He turned off the bedroom light and lay facing the wall. Beyond that wall was Raphael's room. He heard the soft sound of footsteps in the hallway. The door to the guest room creaked open. The bed shifted gently. Then, silence. But his ears caught something. A faint sound. A whisper. Then, a quiet laugh. So soft. Like a whisper that had been held back intentionally. Gabriel opened his eyes. He didn't move. And that night, he knew. Something had changed in their home. But he didn't yet understand just how deep the wound would go. The next morning, Annecy was shrouded in a thin mist. The streets were wet from the rain the previous night. Yellow leaves, fallen from the chestnut trees, clung to the sidewalk and the windows of the old shops. Gabriel woke earlier than usual. His head felt heavy, and his eyes were tired, for he had spent the night lying awake without sleep. He made his way downstairs to the kitchen, brewing his own coffee. Amélie was still upstairs, the faint sound of the shower running from the bathroom. The house once again was eerily quiet, too neat, too still. Gabriel sat at the chair by the window, staring outside, letting the cold morning air touch his face. 15 minutes later, Amélie descended with her wet hair still damp and wearing a grey wool sweater. She looked refreshed, but there was an awkwardness in her gaze when it met Gabriel's. "Aren't you going to the office today?" she asked, pouring tea into a cup. "I'm taking the day off," Gabriel replied. The answer made Amélie pause for a moment. She didn't say anything more. She simply sat down and began scooping yogurt into a small bowl. Soon after, the door to the upper floor opened. Raphael came down the stairs, wearing a dark green sweater and denim pants. His hair was neatly combed, his face clean and bright as always. He smiled at both of them. "Morning," he said casually. Gabriel gave a small nod. Amélie returned a faint smile. Raphael took a piece of bread, spread butter on it, and then sat down at the dining table with them. For a moment, there was nothing but the clinking of spoons, the slurp of tea, and the soft ticking of the old wall clock. But Gabriel noticed the small things. How Amélie and Raphael never looked directly at each other. Yet, in that silence, Gabriel caught a glimpse. When Raphael poured his coffee, his eyes briefly flicked to Amélie. And Amélie, while reaching for the jam, held back a fleeting smile. It was subtle, nearly invisible, but enough to sting Gabriel's chest. He gripped his cup more tightly. "I thought you went out early yesterday," Gabriel suddenly said, looking at Raphael. Raphael seemed slightly taken aback, but quickly regained his composure. "I went out, but it started raining, so I came back for a while. Then I fell asleep." Gabriel nodded slowly. "I thought you went to the library." "Right. I went there in the afternoon." Amélie lowered her gaze. Her face had begun to pale. She stood, took her plate, and walked over to the sink. Raphael tried to keep smiling. Gabriel got up from his chair, grabbed his jacket from the hook, and opened the front door. "Just going out for a bit," he said briefly. He shut the door without looking back. Gabriel walked along the canal, the morning wind biting at his hands. He shoved both hands into his jacket pockets and quickened his pace. The shadows of the previous night flashed through his mind again, the quiet laughter, the soft whispers, Raphael's too casual expression, and Amélie, who now no longer looked him in the eye for long. He stopped in front of the small bridge. The canal's water was still, reflecting the old buildings with a gentle tremor. In the distance, a small boat passed slowly. Gabriel took a deep breath. He had no right to accuse anyone. There was no proof. But his heart refused to be deceived. He returned home around noon. When he walked in, Raphael was reading a book on the sofa. Amélie had disappeared from the living room. Gabriel didn't ask. He walked into their bedroom and locked the door behind him. He sat at the edge of the bed, staring at the photo on the small table. The wedding photo of him and Amélie. Their faces were smiling happily. In that photo, Amélie's hand was firmly holding Gabriel's. He turned the photo over, facing it down. That afternoon, Amélie invited him to dinner. "It's been a while since we had dinner together, just the three of us," she said. Gabriel simply nodded. He didn't want to start any confrontations that night. He wanted to observe more, to see how long they could keep up the pretense. The dining table was set neatly. A small candle flickered in the center. The food was simple but clearly prepared with care: roast chicken, boiled potatoes, fresh salad, and a half-full bottle of red wine. Raphael wore a white shirt. He looked relaxed, even confident. Amélie wore a pale cream-colored dress, her hair simply tied back. Her face was innocent, but there was a sharpness in her eyes whenever they met Gabriel's. They ate in silence for the first 5 minutes. Then, Raphael started speaking, asking about the dam project Gabriel was handling in the mountains. Gabriel answered briefly, not particularly interested in engaging in the conversation. "You look tired, Gabriel," Raphael said suddenly. "You must be working too hard." Gabriel looked at his younger half-brother. His smile was cold. "I'm still strong enough to take care of my own house." Silence. Amélie stared at her plate. Raphael pretended to smile and returned to cutting his chicken. After dinner, Raphael stood up first. "Thanks for the meal, Amélie. It was delicious," he said lightly before heading upstairs. Gabriel didn't move. He still sat with his glass of wine in hand. Amélie started clearing the table. Her hands trembled slightly as she took the plates. "Is there something you want to talk about?" she asked quietly. Gabriel looked at his wife deeply. "Not yet. But maybe soon." Amélie didn't answer. She carried the plates to the kitchen and began washing them, her back to Gabriel. Her shoulders were tense. The sound of water running in the sink filled the dining room, which had fallen silent once more. Gabriel got up from his chair, walked to the window, and stared outside. The canal lights had turned a yellowish hue. The shadows of trees trembled on the water's surface. Outside, the city of Annecy slowly fell asleep. But inside that house, something was quietly awakening. Something that would never return to the way it once was. Gabriel decided to observe further. In the following days, he pretended to go about his routine as usual. He woke up early, made his coffee, left the house, and acted as though he was working like before. But in silence, he carefully crafted small steps to uncover what had never been spoken aloud. He knew that something was happening within that house. Something he couldn't quite explain, but his body could feel it. He didn't need an admission, only one moment of honesty that could explain everything. And for that, he needed to stay silent longer. That morning, Gabriel once again pretended to leave earlier than usual. He put on his jacket and work shoes, stepped outside, and slammed the front door shut. But as soon as he reached the end of the alley, he turned right, sneaking through the narrow passageway toward the back of the house. The corridor was narrow, just wide enough for one person, filled with wild plants growing from between the stones. He descended a few steps into the backyard, where an old shed and a pile of wood lay. There he found the back door, which was only ever used in emergencies. Gabriel stood still, regulated his breath, then slowly opened the door without making a sound. He entered the house, holding his breath. His watch showed 20 minutes past 8. Footsteps echoed from above. Then the sound of a door opening. And then, laughter. It was soft, very soft. But enough to seep into Gabriel's ears like poison. He moved quietly towards the dining room. The thin curtain there fluttered slightly from the breeze coming through the half-open window. Morning light filtered through the fabric, casting a faint shadow on the wall. Gabriel approached and stood behind the curtain. He didn't move. He didn't breathe too loudly. From behind the curtain, he saw the living room. There, sitting were two people he knew all too well. Raphael, wearing a white t-shirt and trousers, sat at the end of the sofa. Amélie sat close beside him, closer than she should have. They were laughing softly, discussing something. Raphael touched Amélie's hair, tucking it behind her ear. And Amélie allowed him to. Gabriel felt his heart stop. But his body didn't react. He remained still. He stayed behind the curtain, which now felt like an invisible wall between two worlds. The world where he believed, and the world where everything had crumbled. Raphael lifted his hand, touching Amélie's cheek. Amélie closed her eyes. Then she leaned in, her head resting on Raphael's shoulder. Gabriel closed his eyes. Just for a moment. But when he opened them again, everything was the same. They were still there. Still in a world that left no room for him. The sound of small footsteps echoed on the stairs. Gabriel immediately withdrew, slipping out of the house through the back door like a shadow. He returned to the narrow alley, then walked back to the main road. At the end of the alley, he stopped. His hands trembled. His stomach churned. But his face remained blank. That day, he didn't go to the office. He didn't know where to go. He walked along the canal, then sat on a bench by the lake. The water of Lake Annecy appeared still, almost unmoving. But inside him, there was a storm that could not be quelled. That evening, when Gabriel returned home, the house was quiet again. Raphael wasn't in sight. Amélie greeted him with a small smile in the kitchen. She was, as usual, preparing something light. Pumpkin soup and toast. Gabriel sat at the dining table, staring at his wife's back as she faced away from him. "Where's Raphael?" he asked flatly. Amélie stopped stirring the pot, but only for a moment. "He went out. He said he had an interview at a design studio near the city center." Gabriel didn't ask any further questions. He simply nodded, then stood up and walked to the bedroom. He sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the floor. His hand slipped into the pocket of his jacket. He pulled out something. A small necklace. It was Amélie's necklace. The one he had given her on their 3rd wedding anniversary. That necklace was supposed to hang around Amélie's neck every day. But earlier that morning, as he exited through the back alley, he saw something lying on the ground near the back door. The necklace. The chain was slightly bent, and the pendant was dirty with dirt. Gabriel gripped the necklace tightly. Then he put it back in his pocket. Night came. Amélie sat on the sofa reading a book. Gabriel sat in the chair by the window, staring out at the canal. The streetlights glowed a yellow hue, reflecting on the surface of the water. The sound of footsteps came from the stairs. Raphael came down, wearing a jacket and carrying a motorcycle helmet. "I'm heading out for a bit," he said briefly. Gabriel glanced up. His eyes briefly met Raphael's. "Don't stay out too late," Gabriel said softly. Raphael smiled faintly. "Of course." After the door closed, Amélie stood up and said she was going to take a shower. Gabriel nodded. As the sound of the shower began to fill the house from upstairs, Gabriel stood up and walked to the front door. He locked it quietly from the inside, then sat back down. And that night, he waited. He didn't sleep. He didn't turn on the lights. He simply sat in the darkness, with the necklace in his pocket, and eyes that didn't blink, staring at the door. The rain had been falling gently since the night before. Not a heavy downpour, but a fine drizzle that moistened the windows and made the sounds of nature seem like a long whispering murmur surrounding the house. Gabriel still sat in the chair by the window, wearing his thick jacket and scarf, which he hadn't taken off since the night before. His eyes were red. He hadn't slept a single hour. Yet his eyes remained sharp, burning with intensity behind the exhaustion. He didn't want to miss anything that morning. The clock showed 6:15 a.m. The house was still dark. Then there was a sound from outside. A motorcycle pulled up to the gate. Its lights briefly illuminated the mist before fading out. Footsteps on the wet ground approached the front door. Gabriel didn't move. He only listened to the sound of the key turning. Then the door opened slowly. Raphael entered quietly, closing the door as gently as possible. He moved silently through the living room, sneaking up the stairs with light steps. But Gabriel had already heard everything. When Raphael disappeared upstairs, Gabriel stood. He walked to the front door and locked it again. Then he headed to the kitchen. The room was dark and cold. But on the wooden table near the window, there was a piece of paper he had never seen before. Gabriel pulled out a chair and sat down. His hand reached for the paper. It was Amelie's handwriting. Neat and deliberate, as always. I'm stepping out for a while. I need some time alone. Don't look for me. Raphael doesn't know anything. Gabriel read those words twice. Then 3 times. The last sentence made him stop. Not because he believed it, but because he knew it was written not to offer clarity, but to hide something. His fingers trembled as he clutched the letter. Then he stood and opened the kitchen cupboard. He took a cup, filled it with hot water, and brewed tea as usual. He placed the letter back on the table. He didn't want to hide it. Not tonight. He sat down with his tea, sipping the bitter liquid. His eyes gazed out at the backyard through the kitchen window. The mist began to settle again, thin but enough to consume all shadows. Later that day, Gabriel did not go to the office. He took his coat and walked down the narrow road toward the city center. He wasn't in a hurry. He let the rain soak into his shoulders. The cold wind slipped beneath his scarf, but he didn't mind. By the time he reached Rue Royale, the atmosphere had become livelier. People were walking by, some with umbrellas, others jogging lightly toward the shops. He turned into a small alley leading to the old market. At the corner of the moss-covered stone building, there was the flower shop Amélie used to visit often. The shopkeeper knew Gabriel. He greeted him warmly. Gabriel only smiled briefly before stepping into the small shop beside it, a store that sold notebooks and leather journals. He bought a small book and a pen. The cover was dark brown, with a leather tie wrapped around it. Gabriel sat in the small park by the canal. He opened the first page of the book and began writing slowly. I smell the lies behind the door. I hear the truth through the cracks in the floor. Yet I still sit in the same chair in the same house, hoping that it's not real. He closed the book and tucked it into his jacket pocket. By late afternoon, Gabriel returned home. This time, the house was completely empty. There were no sounds of footsteps. No running water. No signs of life. He walked to the bedroom, sat at the edge of the bed, and closed his eyes for a moment. After a few minutes, he stood and opened Amélie's wardrobe. Empty. Several warm clothes were missing from the hangers. The top drawer was left slightly open. Gabriel pulled it slowly. Inside was a small round box. A silver perfume box. He opened it and inhaled the scent he knew so well. Amélie's scent. The same scent since the beginning of their time together. He closed his eyes, put the box back, and calmly closed the drawer. On the vanity, there was a hairpin that Amélie used to wear. It was shaped like a maple leaf, small and elegant. Gabriel picked it up, stared at it for a moment, then held it tightly. In Raphael's room, the bed remained neat. But there was a faint scent of men's perfume. Gabriel opened the wardrobe and saw clothes hanging neatly. But in the corner of the floor, there was a small plastic bag containing a bookstore receipt. The store's name was Rue Saint Clair. The same shop he had visited earlier that morning. He took the receipt and read it. It was a purchase receipt, but not under Raphael's name. The name on the receipt was Amélie Laurent. The date was 2 days ago. Gabriel sat on the edge of Raphael's bed. His eyes stared at the empty floor. Night began to fall. The house lights were turned on. The mist grew thicker. Gabriel made a simple soup and sat to eat alone. The sound of the clock ticking was louder than usual. Outside, the sound of leaves falling was like raindrops. At 9 o'clock that evening, there was a knock at the front door. Gabriel stood and opened it slowly. Amélie stood at the door. Her face was pale. Her hair wet. Her eyes swollen. Gabriel stared at her deeply. But he said nothing. Amélie stepped inside. She hung up her jacket. Then she stood by the heater, warming her hands. Gabriel went into the kitchen, poured the soup into another bowl, and handed it to her. They sat at the dining table in silence. Amélie spooned her food slowly. Gabriel only stared at the soup in front of him, not touching anything. After a few minutes, Amélie spoke. I just needed time. Gabriel didn't answer. It's not like you think, she continued. Gabriel remained silent. He stared into Amélie's eyes, and there, He only saw the reflection of himself. Tired. Left behind. Cracked. That night, they slept in the same bed. But their bodies never touched. And between them, there was a space that words could never reach. That morning, the sky remained overcast. The fog still clung to the canal and the streets of the city. Gabriel stood on the second-floor balcony of his home, wearing a warm wool sweater that felt useless against the cold. He stared across the canal, at the row of old buildings standing as silent witnesses to every whisper, every step, and every hidden feeling behind the windows. On the balcony next door appeared a figure Gabriel hadn't seen in weeks. Madame Renard, the elderly woman with white hair always neatly pinned up and dressed in a floral coat that seemed worn by time. She lived alone, 2 houses away from Gabriel's. Her face always seemed sharp, as if she could see through walls and windows. Madame Renard gave a slow nod. Gabriel returned the gesture politely. But before he could turn away, her old voice broke the cold morning air. "Gabriel, you look lonelier than usual." Gabriel smiled faintly. He didn't know how to respond. "Sometimes, a house no longer feels like a home," Madame Renard continued. "It becomes just walls, silent and full of too many voices." Gabriel lowered his gaze. He wanted to argue, but there were no words strong enough to oppose her. Madame Renard tilted her head slightly. "A few nights ago, I saw the light still on until morning. You didn't sleep." Gabriel didn't answer. Sometimes, when someone is too silent, it's not because they don't know, but because they know too much. Her words hung in the air, like fog that refused to lift. Gabriel nodded slowly, then turned and went back inside the house, closing the balcony door behind him. That day, Raphael wasn't home. Amélie had been gone since the morning. Gabriel sat in the living room, replaying the small incidents from the past, moments that once seemed insignificant but now felt like pieces of a puzzle slowly forming a bitter image. He remembered when Raphael first moved in with them. How Amélie quickly adjusted, laughed more often when Raphael was around, and grew quiet whenever it was just the 2 of them. He remembered the evenings when the 3 of them had dinner together, and how he always felt that Raphael and Amélie shared a secret language that he couldn't understand. All of it was so subtle, so polite, but so real. Gabriel stood up and walked to Raphael's room. He opened the door slowly. The room was neat, cold, and there had been no significant changes. But the faint scent of soap and men's cologne still lingered in the air. He walked over to the small desk by the bed. There was an open notebook. Gabriel looked at the handwritten line. "Sometimes, stepping into the wrong place feels more comfortable than standing too long in the right one." He closed the notebook slowly, then opened the bottom drawer of the desk. Inside was a small wooden box. Gabriel pulled it out and opened the lid. Inside was an old photo of the 3 of them having lunch by the lake. Gabriel was in the middle, smiling widely. Amélie was on his right, her hand resting on his shoulder. Raphael was on the left, gazing at Amélie, not at the camera. Gabriel stared at the photo for a long time. His eyes welled with tears, but no tears fell. He put the photo back into the box, closed it again, and placed it back in its spot. Then he left the room without saying a word. By late afternoon, Amélie returned. She was carrying a shopping bag from a small store near the cathedral. Gabriel watched her from the kitchen. "I bought some cheese and bread. Maybe we'll have a simple meal tonight," she said. Gabriel nodded. He took a plate and began setting the table. They ate in silence. Amélie seemed like she wanted to say something, but didn't know where to begin. Gabriel only focused on his bread and soup. There was no argument. But there was no closeness either. After dinner, Amélie washed the dishes. Gabriel sat on the living room sofa. When Amélie walked past him, she paused. "I know you're suspicious," Amélie said softly. Gabriel looked at her. His face remained calm. "You don't need to deny it," he replied. Amélie stood still. Her eyes were glassy. "I don't want to ruin anything, but I can't keep pretending." Gabriel stared at her. "It's already broken, Amélie. And not because you said it." Amélie covered her mouth with her hand, holding back a breath, then turned and walked upstairs. Gabriel didn't follow. He simply sat on the sofa, listening to every step she took upstairs, counting down to the inevitable end that he couldn't avoid. That night, Gabriel left the house. He walked toward Pont des Amours. The wind by the lake made his eyes sting. He stood in the middle of the bridge, staring at the water as it gently rippled. The streetlights cast a dim reflection on the surface. He remembered the moment when he first held Amélie's hand in that spot. When he proposed, when he kissed her forehead for the first time, and when they both swore they would never walk alone. Now that place was just a place. Without meaning. At the end of the bridge, footsteps echoed. Raphael stood there. Whether by accident or fate, they met in a place that had once been a memory. They didn't move closer. They just stood in silence. Raphael lowered his head. Gabriel stared at him. Neither of them said a word. And in that silence, all the unspoken truths echoed louder than any words ever could. Gabriel sat alone in a small café hidden in Rue Saint-Clair, a narrow cobblestone alley filled with old buildings, low roofs, and black iron hanging lamps. The café was tucked beneath an ancient stone archway, nearly invisible from the main road, as if it were a place created for those who didn't want to be found. He had known this place for years. It was where he used to read or write during his college days. In the dim corner of the café, surrounded by the scent of aged wood and black coffee, Gabriel opened the leather notebook he had bought a few days ago. He wrote with his left hand, which trembled slightly from the cold. Betrayal doesn't always come with a scream. Sometimes, it arrives like morning rain, silent but cutting to the bone. The waiter approached, setting a cup of black coffee and a piece of chocolate cake that was starting to melt on a white plate. Gabriel nodded his thanks and returned to staring at the empty page in front of him. The clock read 10:20 a.m. It was a holiday, and the city of Annecy was still quiet, the fog not yet fully lifted. Outside, pedestrians passed by, wrapped in thick coats, hurrying toward shops or the morning market. But inside the café, the world seemed frozen, as though time had stopped moving. Gabriel took a sip of the coffee. Its bitterness burned his throat, leaving an odd aftertaste that somehow suited the morning. At another table sat an old woman. Her face was unfamiliar, but her gaze was sharp. She watched Gabriel for a while before speaking. Sometimes, things are only visible when we stop looking for them. Gabriel turned. His eyes met hers. "What do you mean, madam?" he asked. She smiled faintly. "You've been staring at the window too long, as if waiting for something to come from outside. But sometimes, what we seek is sitting next to us all along." Gabriel didn't respond. He only nodded slightly and turned back to his notebook. The woman stood, paid, and left without a glance back. Gabriel let out a quiet breath. 2 hours later, Gabriel left the café. He walked along the canal, crossing a small bridge covered in dew. When he reached an old park by the lake, he slowed his pace. At a wooden bench near a maple tree, Raphael sat alone. He looked tired. His hair was messy. His jacket was damp at the shoulders. He saw Gabriel, but didn't stand. Gabriel walked over. "Alone?" he asked. Raphael nodded. "How many days has it been since you slept at home?" Gabriel continued. Raphael stared at the lake in front of him. "Long." Then he answered softly. 4 days. Gabriel sat at the edge of the same bench. They sat in silence. Raphael finally spoke. "I never meant to destroy anything." Gabriel turned to him, his eyes cold. The one who starts the fire rarely realizes when their house begins to burn. Raphael nodded, his hand gripping his knee. "We didn't plan it. I swear." Gabriel said nothing. He just stared at the wet leaves falling slowly to the ground. "I've been jealous of you since we were kids," Raphael continued. "You always knew where to go. You had direction. But me? I just followed, then got lost." "You weren't lost," Gabriel replied. "You just chose a path that made everyone else lose their footing." Raphael closed his eyes. "Do you love her?" Gabriel asked quietly. Raphael lowered his head. "I thought not. But it turns out yes." Gabriel stood. Love should make people better, not make them cowards. Then he walked away, leaving Raphael alone on the park bench. That night, Amélie waited in the kitchen. She sat at the table, wearing a thin sweater and loose pants. Her hair was down, her face bare of makeup. Gabriel entered, hung his damp coat on the rack, washed his hands, dried them, and sat across from her. "I saw Raphael today," he said. Amélie lowered her gaze. "He said he loves you." Amélie slowly looked at Gabriel. Her eyes were wet. I don't know how all of this happened." Gabriel stared at her face, one he had known so well. "How long?" he asked. Amélie closed her eyes. She took a long breath. Then she answered, 3 months. Gabriel swallowed. His hands on the table slowly clenched. "At first, it was just casual conversation," Amélie continued. "But every day I felt, he filled the space you left empty." Gabriel lowered his head. "You know I work for us. For this house." She nodded, tears falling. "But that house isn't enough if all it has is routine." The sound of the rain outside grew faint. "What do you want from me now?" Gabriel asked, his voice quiet but deep. I don't know," Amélie answered. Gabriel stood, then walked to the window. He stared at the canal, which reflected the yellow lights of the town. "I want you to leave tonight," he said, not looking back. Amélie stood, her body trembling. "Gabriel." "It's not because I hate you," he continued. "But because if you stay, we'll rot together." Amélie didn't respond. She just walked to the bedroom, packed a small bag, and came back to the living room. At the threshold of the door, she looked back. Their eyes met for the last time that night. Then the door closed. And Gabriel stood alone, in a house that now felt emptier than it ever had before. The days following Amélie's departure felt like a vast empty space stretching endlessly. Gabriel still woke up at the same time, sat in the same chair, and stared out the window as usual. But everything had changed. Not because the house was quieter, but because the sounds he had once ignored now echoed relentlessly in his head. He tried to live as before. Opening his laptop, reading project reports, answering a few emails, then closing it all without finishing anything. His focus had faded. Time passed without direction. He didn't even realize when the day turned into night. One afternoon, Gabriel walked to the small bookstore at the corner of Place St. Clair. He chose a book at random, not because he wanted to read it, but because he wanted to feel busy. He bought a French poetry book, an old work with yellowing pages. When he paid at the counter, the elderly shopkeeper, a man with round glasses who usually greeted him warmly, said softly, "I haven't seen you around much lately." Gabriel smiled faintly. "I haven't seen much of myself either." The old man nodded, then handed him a paper bag. "I hope the poetry helps." Gabriel returned home with the book, but never read it. He simply placed it on the small table beside his bed, as a symbol that he was trying to hold on. A few days later, Raphael returned. He knocked on the door nervously, carrying a suitcase and looking more gaunt than before. Gabriel opened the door without saying much. Raphael stood at the threshold. "I have nowhere else to go," he said softly. Gabriel looked at his younger brother. "You still have options. But if you want to stay here, you know the rules." Raphael nodded. "No more lies. No more Amélie." Raphael nodded more firmly. "I understand." Gabriel opened the door wider. They lived in the same house, but it was no longer the same. They each moved through the old house like two planets orbiting it with their own separate orbits. Gabriel downstairs. Raphael mostly upstairs. No conversations, no shared meals. Only the sounds of footsteps, water running, and occasionally the creak of the floor reminding them that the other was still alive. Gabriel wrote in his notebook every night. "Sometimes, it's easier to forgive strangers, because they never leave a trace inside your house." One night, Gabriel couldn't sleep. He got out of bed and went down to the kitchen. He made tea, then sat at the table, staring at the cupboard that stood half open. Inside, one long coat belonging to Amélie still hung. He had never moved it. Raphael came down slowly, unable to sleep as well. He sat across the table without saying a word. Gabriel didn't turn. But he felt the presence. They sat in silence for a long while, until Raphael finally spoke. "I'm sorry." Gabriel remained silent. "I know I destroyed you. But I also destroyed myself." Gabriel looked at his cup of tea. "So what do you want me to do?" Feel sorry for you. Raphael shook his head. No. Do you want me to hug you and say everything will be all right? Not that either. Gabriel raised his gaze. Then why are you here, Raphael? Raphael sighed. Because I don't know how to fix something I've burned myself. Gabriel smiled bitterly. Nothing can be fixed. All you can do is look at the ashes and wonder why you were foolish enough to let it burn. Raphael lowered his head. Gabriel stood, took his cup to the sink, and returned to his room without saying another word. Raphael remained seated at the kitchen table, like a child who had lost its way in their own home. The next day, Gabriel returned to work. He tried slowly to ease back into his routine, into a world he had left behind for weeks. His colleagues greeted him with questions and sympathy, but Gabriel responded briefly and calmly. He didn't want sympathy. He just wanted to feel normal again. In his office, he opened the design for the new dam project in the Eastern Mountains. He marked key points on the paper, wrote technical notes. But his mind kept drifting to other things. To the letter Amélie left. To Raphael's confession of love. To the silence that had now become his everyday companion. After work, Gabriel didn't go straight home. He went to Pont des Amours once again. This time, there was no one there. Only the sound of the lake's water and the wind brushing against his hair. He stood there for a long time. Then, he took out his notebook and wrote one sentence. Love doesn't die because of betrayal. Love dies because no one fights for it when the first wound appears. A few days later, a letter arrived. Not from Amélie, but from his mother. Inside was a brief message. I've heard about what happened. If you can, come to the winter house in Lyon. There is something we need to talk about. About your past, and why all of this may not be a coincidence. Gabriel read the letter several times. He felt there was something he didn't know. Something that might have been buried long before Amélie entered his life. And that night, for the first time since all of this began, Gabriel decided to leave. Not to forget, but to dig deeper into a direction he had long avoided. Into the source of the wound. The train carrying Gabriel to Lyon departed before the sun rose. The cabin windows were covered in a thin mist, and the sound of the wheels rolling over the tracks was like the whisper of time passing. Outside, the French countryside was blanketed in morning fog, and inside his mind, Gabriel was lost in memories he had never managed to sort out over the years. He hadn't set foot in the family's winter house since his father's funeral 10 years ago. The house, once only used during Christmas holidays, sat on a small hill to the west of Lyon, surrounded by fir trees and seldom used footpaths. It had once felt warm, but over time, it had become foreign, much like the faces within it. As Gabriel stepped off the train and took a taxi toward the house, light snow began to fall. It wasn't heavy, but enough to blur the rooftops and the path leading up to the door. When he arrived at the old green gate of the house, everything felt like a somber dream. His mother, Madame Laurence, opened the door wearing a fur coat and a hand-knit scarf. Her face hadn't changed, but her eyes held a weight, something unspoken. They didn't embrace. They stood for a moment before Gabriel stepped inside. It's been a while, his mother said. Yes, Gabriel replied. Thank you for coming. Gabriel simply nodded and placed his bag on the creaky wooden floor, which seemed to groan under the weight of time. They sat in the living room, near the fireplace, which had just been lit. The scent of burning wood slowly filled the air, offering some warmth to the otherwise awkward conversation. Why did you want me to come here? Gabriel finally asked. Madame Laurence sighed deeply, then opened an old wooden box from a nearby cupboard. Inside there were old papers, letters, photographs, and one item that Gabriel immediately recognized, a small leaf-shaped pendant, identical to the one Amélie used to wear. Gabriel stared at his mother sharply. Why do you keep this? Because I knew a day like this would come, she replied calmly. She pulled out an old photograph. 2 young children stood side by side. Gabriel recognized himself in the photo, but the child beside him wasn't Raphael. I don't understand, Gabriel said. Madame Laurence met his gaze. There's something we never told you. Raphael is not your father's son. Gabriel froze. He's your Uncle André's child. Before marrying me, your father had cared for André, who had mental illness. Raphael was born from a brief, complicated relationship. After André passed, your mother, your grandmother, and your father agreed to raise Raphael as if he were their own. Gabriel listened to everything without blinking. So he's my cousin? Legally, yes. But emotionally, your father wanted you both to grow up as brothers. He didn't want Raphael to feel like an outsider. Gabriel stood up and walked over to the window, trying to make sense of everything. Why now? Because I've seen this happen again. The same pattern. Brothers who fall for their brother's beloved. Wounds that repeat. Gabriel let out a small bitter laugh. And you think this will heal something? No, his mother replied. But perhaps it will make you stop hating someone who's always lived in your shadow. Gabriel didn't answer. He walked out of the house, stepping into the heavier snowfall. He walked along the path toward the small hill behind the house. From there, he could see all of Lyon, swallowed in heavy white mist. He sat on a stone bench, opened his notebook, and wrote. Sometimes, your enemy isn't the one who destroys you. It's the story silently passed down, one you live out without ever knowing where it came from. That night, they had dinner together. The meal was simple, pumpkin soup and toasted bread, much like what Amélie used to make. Gabriel ate slowly, recalling every movement of his mother's hands, every word spoken with careful tone. Does Raphael know who he really is? He asked finally. No. But I think he suspected it for a long time. Maybe that's why he's always felt like he wasn't enough. Gabriel remained silent. You don't have to forgive Gabriel, his mother said. But you also don't have to carry a burden that isn't yours. The next day, Gabriel walked alone to the station. He didn't want to be picked up. He wanted to go home on his own. But before he boarded the train, he sent a short message to Raphael. I know who you are. And I know why this happened. But for now, we remain two strangers in the same house. After that, he turned off his phone. He sat in the train seat, staring at the snow outside the window as it fell, slowly erasing everything. But Gabriel knew, some wounds could never be healed. Some wounds could only be remembered. Gabriel returned to Annecy 2 days after leaving Lyon. The journey back felt much longer, even though the duration was the same. On the train, he didn't open his book, didn't write, he just sat still, like someone who had just received a truth they never asked for. When he arrived at the house, everything remained the same. The windows were shrouded in fog, the sound of melting snow from the roof, and the damp wood smell greeted him from inside. Raphael was home. He sat in the kitchen, wearing a gray hoodie that seemed to have been worn for 3 days straight. In front of him, a cup of coffee, now cold. Gabriel simply placed his suitcase in the living room and then went into his room, closing the door behind him. He didn't say a word. Not that night, and not the following morning. They lived like shadows, each moving on their own. Raphael tried to act normal, occasionally cleaning the house, cooking, or turning on the heater. But Gabriel didn't respond. He was completely silent. And in that silence, there was a pressure that made the air inside the house heavier than usual. Gabriel didn't know who he should be angry with. Amélie? Raphael? Their father, who had hidden the truth from him his entire life. Or himself, for allowing everything to unfold right before his eyes? That morning, Gabriel sat in his study, staring at the drawing table that hadn't been touched since the previous month. Next to it, there was the small photo he had found in Raphael's room, the photo from lunch by the lake, when everything still seemed whole. But now, every smile in that photo felt like a mockery. Raphael stood in the doorway. I can leave if it makes you feel better, he said softly. Gabriel turned slowly. His gaze was no longer angry, but neither was it soft. It was just empty. If you leave, it won't heal anything. You're still part of this. Raphael lowered his gaze. Did you talk to Mom? Gabriel nodded. So now you know. Yes. Raphael took a deep breath. I've always felt incomplete. Like I was just left here. Slipped quietly into your life. Gabriel stood, walked closer, and stood in front of his younger brother. You weren't left. You were accepted. But you ruined it yourself. Raphael fought back the tears that had started to gather. Gabriel walked toward the door, then said softly, the silence you've kept all this time finally exploded. And now, There's nothing left to build from its ruins. Days passed, and Gabriel began to slowly reorganize the house, tidying up a little bit at a time. He cleaned out the wardrobe, moved things he no longer needed, and donated some of Amélie's clothes to charity. But the long coat that hung in the kitchen was still left there. For some reason, he couldn't bring himself to touch it. One afternoon, as heavy rain fell and the fog hung lower than usual, Gabriel went to the small photo framing shop in the city center. He brought with him an old photo of his father and mother when they were young. He wanted to replace the frame, something that wouldn't remind him of the winter house. While waiting in the shop, a middle-aged woman sat next to him. Her hair was short, partially graying, and her left hand wore a silver ring. "You look like someone trying to erase the past," she said suddenly. Gabriel turned. "Maybe." The woman smiled. "I've done that too. But it turns out the past can't be erased. It can only be seen from a different angle." Gabriel smiled faintly. "Does that help?" "No," she answered. "But at least I stopped blaming myself." That night, Gabriel returned home and sat in the kitchen, turning on the dim hanging light. Raphael was already asleep in his room. The house was so quiet, but not suffocating anymore. It was silent, like a forest after a storm. Everything had been destroyed, but there was nothing left to break. He wrote in his notebook, "The stifling silence doesn't come from others. It comes from a part of yourself that's too afraid to speak." A few days later, Gabriel received an envelope with no name on it in the mailbox. Inside was a single sheet of handwritten paper from Amélie. "Gabriel, you might hate me, and that's your right. But I want you to know something I never had the chance to say. From the beginning, I've always felt closer to Raphael. Maybe because he's more open. Maybe because he seemed to need me more. But that doesn't mean I didn't love you. I just didn't know how to love you in the silence you built around us." Gabriel read the letter over and over. He didn't know whether it made him feel more at peace or more broken. But one thing was certain, the letter closed something. It closed the space that had always been open to wounds. A few nights after that, Raphael packed his things and left the house. There was no argument. No dramatic farewell. Just the sound of the suitcase wheels being dragged down the stairs, then the sound of the front door closing softly. Gabriel stood at the window, watching the snow begin to fall again. He stared at the empty street, and for the first time in a long while, he felt that the house truly belonged to him. Empty, yes, but no longer suffocating. That morning, Annecy was once again shrouded in light fog. The snow had stopped falling the night before, leaving frozen puddles at the corners of streets and a thin layer of ice on the surface of the canal. Outside his window, Gabriel stood in silence. His hands gripped a cup of hot tea, but his lips never touched the rim. He simply stared at the glass, fogged over by condensation, as though searching for something he could never truly see clearly. The house now truly belonged to him. Raphael had left several days ago. No news, no address. Only silence, the mark of their farewell. And Amélie, she too had vanished, leaving behind a shadow that couldn't be fully erased. Gabriel exhaled and slowly descended the stairs. Each step felt like an echo of the past, resonating through the empty walls of the house. He put on his coat, scarf and boots, then opened the door. The morning air greeted him, cold and sharp, biting through the gaps in his fingers. But Gabriel kept walking, heading down the small path toward the lake. Pont des Amours stood as usual, a wrought iron bridge connecting the two sides of the park. In the middle, Gabriel stopped. Below, the lake's water appeared frozen on the surface. Not completely solid, but enough to make any reflection unclear. He stared at it for a long time, as if searching for the reflection of himself that had disappeared. Beside him, the park bench they used to sit on was still intact. The wood was slightly cracked, its green paint faded. Gabriel sat there. He opened his notebook. The last page was still blank. His hand moved to write, but paused. He heard footsteps from afar. When he looked up, a woman wearing a cream-colored coat and neatly tied hair approached slowly. She wasn't Amélie, but someone who looked strikingly similar, her height, posture, and way of walking. As she drew nearer, Gabriel recognized her. Clara, the woman who had once worked with him on the lake project. They had shared coffee on rainy days, exchanged quiet laughs between overtime hours, and then vanished from each other's lives once the project was finished. But this morning, Clara stood before him. "Do you still remember me?" she asked. Gabriel nodded. "Clara, the architect who loves jazz." Clara smiled faintly. "And you?" "Gabriel, the one who writes but never shows his writing." Gabriel returned the smile, though it was faint. "What brings you here?" "I saw your name in the city's report about the new dock development plans. I thought you might be back in Annecy." "Maybe I never really left." Clara sat on the same bench, on the opposite side. "You look like someone who's just come out of a long, harsh winter," she said softly. Gabriel nodded. "A long season." "Are you still writing?" "Every night. But only for myself." Clara looked at him. "Maybe one day, you'll write for others." Gabriel didn't answer. But he opened his notebook, and for the first time in a long while, he wrote a sentence that didn't sound like a complaint or a lament. His hand moved slowly but surely. "Some reflections will never appear on the surface. But that doesn't mean they don't exist." The days that followed passed like petals blooming slowly. There was no explosion of happiness. No sudden escapes. Just small meetings, brief conversations, and a peace that began to grow from the soil that had once been shattered. Clara came occasionally. They drank tea, talked about new projects, and sometimes laughed over trivial things. Gabriel never mentioned Amélie's name. Clara never asked. In his study, Gabriel began to draw again. Sketch after sketch appeared on the paper: a small bridge, a wooden house, a calm lake, and a quiet garden. None of it for clients. Just for himself. One afternoon, he opened a drawer and found that photo again, the one of him, Amélie, and Raphael. He stared at it for a long time, then placed it in a small box and locked it away. He didn't throw it away. But he chose to keep it out of sight. That evening, Gabriel sat in the living room. Near the fireplace, his notebook lay open. He wrote the last sentence. "I won't wait for the reflection in the frozen water. But I will stand at its edge, listening to the sound of the lake, and knowing that something once existed and maybe, still does." Outside, the snow fell gently. Not heavily. But enough to cover the rooftops, erase footprints, and make the world seem a little newer. Gabriel stood at the window, watching the city lights glow softly. He knew, some things cannot be fixed. Some wounds never heal. But in the silence he chose, he found something more important than forgiveness. He found presence. Not from others, but from himself. And there, Gabriel stood. No longer as Amélie's husband. No longer as Raphael's brother. But as someone who had finally dared to embrace the silence he once feared. In the same town. In the same house. But with a heart that slowly accepted that not all wounds need to heal, for life to continue. Love can fade. Trust can break. But from its ruins, one can begin to see themselves more honestly. Perhaps not to return, but to endure. Because in the long silence, sometimes, one truly begins to know who they are. And that is enough.